We don't have any presentations tonight, so we're going to go ahead and start with a roll call, and then we'll have our pledge allegiance, and then we're going to go into our first public comment. So, but we'll start with a roll call. Mrs. Sugars, please.
Mrs. Matlack,
Here.
Mrs. Neary,
Here.
Mrs. Seidel,
Here.
Mrs. Scarpolino, Mrs. Schultz,
Here.
Mrs. Tong,
Here.
Mr. Goodwin.
Here. Now let's stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Good evening, everyone. We are going to start off with first public comment. You have two opportunities for comment. The first public comment is for agenda items only, and if you have an agenda item that you would like to comment on, please come up. You'll have 3 minutes to please state your name and address, as well as the topic that or the item that you'd like to discuss, and you'll have 3 minutes to discuss that item. And there's a timer above here that will let you know when your time's up. Any takers? Okay. All right. If not, we're going to start off with our committee of a whole, and we're going to have several presentations. One for curriculum and instruction, one for business and facilities, one for human resources, one for policy and legislation, and finally one for strategic planning. And we're going to start off with Dr. Smith presenting for curriculum and instruction.
I don't know, my first committee of the whole, so just expect at least one or two microphone snafus, so that'd be par. Bogey would be 3 or 4. So, and the topics for CNI tonight all relate to English. So I have to, as a former English teacher, I definitely have to restrain myself and keep it brief, because it's just fun to get a chance to talk about literature. So that doesn't happen, as you can imagine, often. So for me, so the first topic are 3 new novels, which we looked at a prior CNI meeting. So these are for board approval at the high school level. And if you remember, Ms. Violetta Katsikas talked about these at prior CNI. So, and in fact, some of you may have copies of the books. If you do, I'm going to need to try to get those back at some point.
Oh man.
Or you can keep them, because it's totally fine. There's nothing better than loaning a book out and it doesn't come back because it's being passed on to someone else. That's the best fate for a book. So, so the 3 books, Sort of Like a Rock Star, that was Matthew Quick, 9th grade, then Orphan Train, Christina Baker Klein, 10th grade, and All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Durr, 11th grade. So I don't know if anybody had any questions or thoughts on those. If I start going into the synopses of those, that's what I'm going to chew up the minutes. But I'll just suffice to say that each of those is surgically aligned to that age for which they are intended. So they do a great job in the ELA section and all the sections of our curriculum. But definitely there's a lot of thought behind each of those. Any questions or thoughts on those?
So I read Sort of Like a Rock Star, specifically for this, that it came up. I also read All the Light We Cannot See, not for this, but prior. So I'm familiar with the story. And Sort of Like a Rock Star is intended for 9th grade, and as I was reading through it, all I thought it was just perfectly chosen for that grade level. Self-identity, things that they're going through, along with everything else that happened in the book. So, I didn't find anything that I would have a question or concern about, for that grade level, or any of the high school grade levels reading that book. And I think other board members read each of the other two, so I'll let them speak to that, since I just read them for my own pleasure.
Yeah.
And not specifically in regard to our high schoolers reading it.
All right. So we'll go on to the next topic. So theatrical productions, staying with the literature, but now we're adding in so much more. So we have, I have to say, having seen other processes for approval, we have a very thorough process here in Cherry Hill for approval of theater productions. So we have multiple building level administrators, as well as the drama production directors, and then finally our building level, our district level administrators, director of curriculum, director of special services, and finally superintendent, all review our theatrical productions. So, and look at them through a variety of lenses, depictions of people by both through race, gender, ethnicity, all of our attempts to try to vet out how this represents us as a district and who we want to be. So the two pieces that I have are Shakespeare in Hollywood. It's Cherry Hill East's, and that would be, it's intended to be put on the first weekends in December. And this is, it's very layered. So it's taking a Midsummer Night's Dream, Shakespeare, and Shakespeare lends itself really well to transpositions. So it's Shakespeare in Hollywood. So it's a film version of Midsummer Night's Dream that's being put on in the 30s, okay, during the rise of the Nazism. Okay, so it's taking place in Hollywood, but at that point, in 1934, I mean, you already had the Nazi Party in power in Germany, and one of the very first things that party tried to do was stamp out individuality in the arts. So, so the kind of the antagonist in the play is a famous censor, the guy who was essentially the kind of the czar of censorship in Hollywood at the time. This is Will Hayes. He's a historical figure, and so his attempts to try to exert his power over the production of Shakespeare in Hollywood, and the director pushing back on the artistic license of artistic expression. So an added factor in there is Oberon and Titania, who are the king and queen of the fairies from Midsummer Night's Dream. They are the real Oberon and the real Titania are actually in the play. So they're not actors; they're playing themselves, but they're the real king, queen of the fairies. So you have this fantastical element bumping up against, juxtaposed with the real life, sort of larger than life personalities of Hollywood stars, if that makes sense. So it's very kind of slapsticky and fun, So that's that one. I'm gonna, because I could go on, like I said. The other one is Matilda. That's West's, and they're gonna put that on November. And from district perspective, I love the pairing last year of Fiddler on the Roof and Chicago, because it covers kind of different areas of interest, different time periods, and likewise Matilda has, whereas Shakespeare is going to be one audience, it's because there are actual passages from Shakespeare in the production, and then you switch to Matilda, which has such a wide-ranging audience involving, inclusive of all grade levels, and they actually intend to try to use middle and elementary school students in the production. So, which I think, just again, makes us very excited about the vertical articulation and that sense of a farm system and giving kids a chance to explore their artistic interests before they even get to high school. So, so that's West's. And any questions on either of those two?
I
Matilda is November. Mm-hmm.
I don't have a question on those specifically, but I do want to just comment on the process that's in place now. And I personally appreciate having that process in place, given some of the issues we had in the not so distant past. So can you just kind of outline exactly
The process.
those steps?
Yeah.
again?
So there's a sign-off sheet that accompanies the screenplay, and starts at the building level. It's the play is put forward by typically the theater director, and then it goes to the assistant principal for English in the building, and then the principal, and then from there it comes to the district office and goes to our curriculum director and director of special services, and they have conversations about the screenplay and any issues they might see. And there's a series of questions that are asked about each piece. For example, things like, is the theatrical production content appropriate for the students to perform? Does the text include any sensitive or controversial issues? If so, how will this be addressed and supported? And so it's really an attempt to flesh out, not even necessarily that like something would be prohibitive based on a single response, but it allows us to have conversations in advance and to know and to really be thoughtful and deliberate with how we approach any aspect, which we want to do. We want to do that for any, even take Matilda. I mean, that will absolutely be done with Matilda, even though we would think in terms of those questions that there wouldn't be anything, but just in terms of the thoughtfulness that goes into what essentially is a tremendous leverage of resources. When you think about both financial and human resources that we pour into our arts program, which is gets mentioned all the time as one of the jewels in the crown of Cherry Hill Public Schools, rightfully, so that's the process. This process, I think, actually increases the product, not just vetting, but also enhancing and amplifying the quality ultimately. So, yeah. All right. Let's see you now, but you'll see me again for piano. So.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
And next, Mrs. Sugars is going to give us an update on BNF.
So this won't be quite as exciting or as eloquent as the C&I presentation. I can say that I have read The Orphan Train and The Light We Cannot See. They're excellent books. In fact, I lent The Light We Cannot See to Dr. Malash. And Matilda is a Sugars family favorite. I actually have a kitten at home named Matilda because of that play. So we're going to talk about facilities usage. I know this has been somewhat of a topic that has come up lately as we have talked about revenue generation, right? Because we have facilities, our facilities are used round the clock. Our facilities are used by lots of organizations. So the packet that I just handed out to you is pretty much a revamping of everything that has to do with facilities usage. And I don't expect you to look through all of it tonight, but certainly take it home and take a look at it. We revised the opening statement. We revised the policy. Again, this is still in draft form. Revised the regulation, adjusted some things to reflect our current practices, to reflect the turf fields and some of the other things that have been new since this was done last. We revised, if you look at page 14, we have a reservation of rights statement that we added so that the organizations that are renting our facilities understand the rules that goes with that and what some of the highlights of our rules are. On page 15, we upgraded our application. Our application needed some updating, needed to be modernized a little bit, so we did that as well. Our application is currently on our website, so it can be accessed there. And then, starting on page 16, this will be a packet that we will hand to people who want to rent the facilities, so that they understand what all the rules and regulations are, and then they have something that they can refer to when they do that. So this was kind of an effort of updating our policy and our regulations and what we share with the public when they come in and they want to use our facilities. And then also taking a look at the schedule of fees, which starts on page 21, so that we could take a look at that and see where are we in terms of our fees? Are we competitive in terms of our fees? Is that something that we need to take a look at? And is that something that we need to update as well? So basically what we did is we took a look at some area school districts, Morristown, Evesham, Collingswood, and Kingsway, just to kind of see what some of their practices were. I came from the Morristown School District. We had done a lot of this work before I left. We had updated all of our policies and taken a look at our fee schedule there. So we looked at that as well. One of the things that we incorporated into this that was not in the policy before was sort of the classification of groups, so that you would have, and this is on page 3, Class 1 users, Class 2 users, and Class 3 users. Class 3 users would be our organizations that we work with that we typically don't charge, like the Cherry Hill Rec, the Cub Scouts, the PTA, the Education Foundation. Class 2 users would sort of be a group that would kind of fall in the middle, like some of our community-based sports groups where most of the participants are residents of Cherry Hill. And then our Class 1 users would be our dance studios that come in and want to use, profit-making type entities that come in and want to use our facilities for various rentals. So we took a look at what our interior rentals, our building rental rates are currently at, and we feel when we compare ourselves to other districts that we are very competitive in that realm, maybe even a little bit on the high side. But one thing we did find was that we weren't being necessarily consistent in how we were applying it. So I know sometimes that happens over time. You make a deal with a group or you change something for a certain group for a certain reason. So we went back and took a look at that. We had to reach out to a couple groups over the past couple weeks to inform that, well, you weren't being charged, or you were being charged a different rate for custodial than everybody else was, but now you're going to be charged, the same rate as everybody else is. So just trying to make some consistency among our groups and making sure that we're charging them the same. The one area that we do feel that we need to make some changes is with our field rentals. Currently, you can rent a field for $290 for the year. Whether you use it once or you use it 15 times, it's the same rate. And it's been that way for quite some time. So we feel that that's an area that we definitely need to make some changes in because, number one, the wear and tear on our fields and the cost of keeping those fields up to date, whether it's replacing backstops or aerating or bringing fill in or whatever it is that we're doing, it's costly. So that's an area that we're going to recommend that we take a look at. We're leaning towards either coming up with a per season fee for rental and then dividing up, like a fall, a winter, and a spring season. Or a per-use rental fee. We've looked at a couple other districts, and kind of seems to be those are the two models that we have been looking at. So I think that is definitely an area where we need to make some improvements. We also have a couple of groups that just use our parking lots, and I think that's something that we might want to take a look at, whether we want to even a nominal fee for the use of our parking lots for camp pickups or for overflow for events or those kinds of things. So those are two areas that I think that we probably need to make some changes. We currently have 53 groups that rent our facilities. 24 of that is field rental, 3 parking lots. And of those groups, those 53 groups, there's 7 groups that we don't charge anything to, and there's 4 groups that are no charge but custodial. So those 7 would fall into that class 3 user, and those 4 that are no charge but custodial charges would be our class 2 users. So last year in the 2018-19 school year, we brought in about $116,000 in building rental fees. About $70,000 of that was through direct rental, and then the remaining portion of that was from reimbursement of custodial salaries. If a group's coming in on the weekend, we have to bring custodians in to run the buildings. A small piece of that, about $1,500 of it, was for security. Sometimes people will use our security as well when they have a large event or there's something big going on. So for the 18-19 school year, we brought about $116,000 in. I unfortunately did not have a breakdown between what of that is fields and what of that is building usage. Obviously, building usage is going to be a higher cost because that's when you need the custodians and the security and things like that. So I know it's been a topic that we've talked about in terms of revenue generation. And again, this is something that we will continue to talk about. We'll bring it, to the board for readings, official readings, once everybody has a chance to take a look at it. Again, we're not making any recommendations on changing the inside rentals, but definitely think that it is time to take a look at and adjust our field rental policies and fee schedule. Mrs. Matlack.
So are we going to take a look at the field rental and usage before we approve this policy, or is that going to stay in there to be determined and then we look at that after?
I will update you on that. We can either do it, I know next month, when we meet again, we can update you on that and what that looks like. Again, I think we're leaning towards the season rental fee. I feel like we want to ease into the changes. We don't want to go from $290, use it as many times as you want, to $50 every time you use it. So the idea of a per season rental fee kind of appealed to us.
Okay, so that's already in
Yeah.
the works
Yes.
for our consideration soon,
Mhm.
so that this wouldn't have to be delayed by too much in order to get it up
Correct.
and running.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
Is there any other questions?
Is this inclusive of, I think at one point in time we had a agreement with the township because of especially the fields, the turf fields. Does this include that
It
agreement?
wouldn't change anything with the township. You're talking about the turf
Right,
fields?
right.
Yeah, so we would not change our practices in terms of the turf fields. We made an agreement with them when we did the turf fields, and none of that would change at this point.
Okay.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Sugars. Next, we have an update on HR from Mrs. Adrian, or Ms. Adrian. Oh,
Sorry. So I'm just going to give you a quick update on the recruitment. Right now, as of today, we have 26.4 contracted positions open and 10 replacement teachers, which are long-term sub positions.
thank you. That was quick. Okay, and next, Dr. Smith is going to give us an update on P&L.
I really feel like just the very act of walking over here already conveys the unfortunate message that I have more to say than Miss Adrian just did. just a couple items, and they're not literature, so this will be brief. The first one is we've been aiming to review the activity participation fee as a large group. So we are, so our P&L group, and Ms. Tong, like, you're representing P&L tonight. I'm so glad for that. So Ms. Carpolino and I talked about maybe moving that to August. Just she's out. She's the head of that committee and isn't here tonight. And I think we also have 2 vacancies in that committee. So it is what we've done so far is, as you've seen in the materials that have been shared each week, is looked at the existing fees in other districts for comparison. And I know we've talked about that, and I think we want to have more discussion about that, but it may be better to do it when we have more of our group with us. So if no one has any objections, I would move that to August, if that's all right. And I will add, whatever we would, if there were any changes to be made with that, it wouldn't be effective for this coming year anyway. So we would go into effect in 2020, 2021. So there's not an urgency to have something resolved by the start of the school year. The other topic is remote board member attendance. This is one that's come up in our P&L meetings a lot, and we've looked at, there aren't a lot of existing policies out there. Philadelphia School District is really the only school district that has a self-standing remote attendance policy for board members. And and we felt like we carried the ball as far as we could in P&L, and then wanted to bring it to the larger group to see what people's thoughts were about that, whether we need it, if we needed it, what would it look like, just to see what people's thoughts were on that.
So when you say Philadelphia has a policy, so they allow board members to attend the meeting via Skype, via
Good
phone
question.
call?
They don't define the exact technology. It's not. And when I say they have a self-standing policy, it's short. It exists, but it's a lot of it is pending approval by the board. So like the board would essentially, when a person wanted to participate via remote access, they would identify what way they wanted to do it, and then the board would sort of decide whether they felt like that met with what they were expecting for that participation. So things like the number, and there's a lot of questions that one might ask that aren't defined within that policy. So for example, like the number of times per year, or are there certain circumstances when it would be all right, like, or not? So for example, executive session, would that even be possible? That's not addressed in the policy. So we would really be, and I looked at LA, New York, like other places where we would expect that there would be a policy, if there was going to be one, it would be in a district that had a million students. So those sorts of details. One thing we did talk about in P&L is that we felt like we would really want to be precise with how we wrote it. One of my favorite expressions is new recipe, small batch. So if we were going to do something new like that, to try to write it in a way that it would keep it contained, and it would be small, in terms of like what it would allow, so that and Ms. Tong, I don't know if I don't want to feel free to weigh in if I felt like we weren't. Sometimes there's like, there wasn't always a sense of, I don't know if there was a sense of like of urgency, if that makes sense, like what we were looking for. If like sometimes a need comes forward, and then we design something to address the need, and so we know kind of like what we're aiming at. But in this case, I'm not sure that if a need has come forward, it makes it harder to design a way to address, design a policy when we're not quite sure what the contours of the need are, if that makes sense.
Hello. I feel like we have a bigger need for online committee meetings before we have a need for remote board member attendance personally. Like, that's my opinion. Like, I would rather see us pursue a policy for an online committee, streaming our committee meetings before we start to see our board members remote in. I mean, that's my opinion. I could be on an island on my own, but that's just my opinion. But I do appreciate, it sounds like you've done a tremendous amount of research and searched every state on this, but.
Philadelphia. So they had it, you know?
I would agree with Ruth. I mean, since there's already streaming happening on the committee meetings and we're not all there, you're almost at a disadvantage. I think that would come before, because I'd be concerned, how do you do that? Remoting in, and now you've got voting that's taking place, and are you heard correctly? It becomes like Pandora's box.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a little, I mean, I know it's 2019 and we need to be open to the use of technology. Is that the appropriate place? I feel like committee meetings should come first. There's no voting that's happening there.
I sort of agree with the other two ladies. The other thing is that as a board member, we are supposed to be doing our work in public for the public to watch. And if a board member is remote, then the public doesn't have the ability to watch that process. I think when people are watching a meeting of any sort, you know, they look at things, body language, eye contact, communication, deliberation between people on the board and between the public. And I think that remote attendance takes away from that. I'm not in favor of remote attendance. And I have to say that it would be a benefit for me as someone who has to travel occasionally for business and has had to miss some board meetings as a result. But I think it will do the board and our work a disservice. I also feel like we've spoken about this for a couple of months now and don't seem to be any further along in the process than we were when we first talked about it. And I think you made a good point of saying, you know, hey, we did the research and maybe there's really not a need for this. So, I mean, are we at the point where we're in agreement that this isn't something that we want to move forward with and can sort of just move on to some other items?
Thank you for saying that, Lisa. You know, about, you know, our presence here. And Dr. Smith, when you mentioned about usually we, you know, look to draft a policy or a procedure for something to address a need. The committee has been talking about this for several months. And I think why it's so difficult is because we don't know what that need is. We're trying to anticipate what the need may be, but then that's hard to draft a policy around a maybe. So, you know, I appreciate what you said, Lisa, because I feel the same way. Since we haven't, I don't think, I'm not in favor of doing remote board access, you know, at this point. If there becomes a need or something that needs to be addressed, I'd be willing to look at it again in the future and reopen this. But it seems like the committee and our administrators have put a lot of time and effort into this, and we really haven't gotten any much farther than when we started. So maybe it's time to, you know, put it to rest for now. Know that we've, you know, begun the discussion, and when that need or, you know, a question comes up again, we will have a previous starting point to take a look back on these discussions and the information you've gathered. My thoughts.
I definitely agree with what's already been stated. The one thing I will add, though, is that there was a point in time, I want to say 9 years ago, when we had some extraordinary situation where the final vote for the board budget had to go in, and it happened to be over spring break, and for whatever reason that was delayed, and then we had it over spring break, and several board members had already made plans to be away for spring break, and that was the case where we had those board members, me being one of them, who actually voted over Skype. It was very crude, but it worked, and it was an extraordinary situation just because of plans being made, and that hadn't been anticipated that we'd be taking a vote on the budget over spring break. So I don't know how often those things come up. This was like 9 years ago, as I recall. So I guess there could be some extraordinary situation, I don't know, where we absolutely had to take a vote, or where we couldn't just postpone the meeting. I'm not sure if that were the case, but I don't know of any of those cases right now. So I'm definitely in favor of tabling this and moving on to something else, and because I don't see there's a pressing need. At least I don't hear a pressing need from the board.
I'm going to just add a little bit more to what Eric just mentioned. I think I mentioned about the remote meeting at one point only because there's winter time, I think in Christmas or December, and I really find out that's very important when things happen like that. In the inclement weather in Philadelphia, we do, I think there's remote meetings as well for the board. I kind of mentioned to, when we had the PLL. So that was the reason why I brought it up. And I think that's when Dr. Justin Smith looked into it. Because the incoming weather is the budget meeting, or something happened at the last drop and we need to make a quick vote or whatever it is, it will help us. So I think it's good just put it in place, a short policy or something in place, and then we can always go back if we need to, but at least we have something rather than nothing, and then can make certain decisions. That's all I have to say right now. Thank you.
So you would suggest having like, for lack of better words, some kind of extreme situation. If we were in some kind of extreme situation, we had to have a meeting and it was unable to meet, then we'd devise some method of voting in that regard, is kind of what you're saying, or?
If it's deemed necessary, but other than that, we don't have to have it, right? Like, I would say, have something as a backup. Whether it's not in the policy and procedure, then you ask somebody to do something, and then you say, I don't have that in there, so now you can't have anything done. So just for backup plans.
So Eric, when you mentioned the situation from 9 or however many years ago, there wasn't a policy in place and there was an extraordinary circumstance, yet there was a procedure that you were able to follow or something you were able to implement in order to make that happen. So to Sally's point, is there any reason why that same construct or whatever allowed you to make that extraordinary decision last time? That still exists, right? So again, we could do that and we could have that and not have to put it in policy form, right? Am I understanding that correctly? I guess maybe I'm looking at Paul.
So the School Boards Association recommends that boards adopt a policy if they're going to have electronic participation. I personally don't believe that's necessary. I think that authority is inherent in the Open Public Meetings Act, which at the time it was adopted contemplated participation in meetings by telephone. There's an old Attorney General's opinion, which doesn't apply to us but applies to the state, that authorizes state bodies to conduct telephone participation. Electronic participation was obviously not in the cards in terms of Skype or video participation at the time they adopted the statute, but I think it's part and parcel of it. But what school boards have said, because there are a variety of conflicting court decisions over the years, is they recommend that you at least have a policy authorizing it, so that if you choose to do it, you at least have some policy basis to point to if you get challenged. I think that's certainly wise advice, but is it absolutely necessary? I tend to doubt it. I think the authority is already there. So that's where it's coming from.
So I guess for me, I'm still not in favor of creating a policy, if you were interested.
I guess from a board perspective, we're asking the P&L committee to continue down the path of coming up with a policy, or from the board perspective, we're asking them to table it. So I guess it sounds like we're asking them to table it for now, and if we hit a situation, we'll just deal with it in that case.
And then we can revisit again. If an extraordinary situation, like Sally said, should come up in the next year, then we can say, hey, maybe we really should revisit this, or it might not come up for another 9 or 10 years, But yeah, I'm still in favor of tabling the discussion for now.
Do we have a consensus on that? Okay. All right. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'll just, for the record, that was a great example of face-to-face consensus building, right? So, noted. Last item, we have a policy for the second reading. The first reading was in the HR committee. It's 3125.4, which is employment of long-term substitute teachers, replacement teachers. This is basically a wonderful thing. I'll just put it simply. Big shout out to our HR department for working on this. The principals, everyone very excited about this. We've been using Source for Teachers for long-term substitute teachers, and this lets us have our own process of bringing in long-term teachers, which will, I think, have multitude of benefits. So the policy is a new policy. So typically I would point out where the revised policy differs from the prior policy, but in this case there is no prior. So, but it's the details are all in there, and it's a really good thing. So, if anyone has any questions on that? All right, thank you, everybody.
Thank you. And finally, we have our discussion on the board goals, and Dr. Malash is going to lead that discussion. I know there were definitely folks that wanted to kind of look at this again, and so we have Dr. Malash taking us forward on that.
So we've included the board goals again. We included them in the committee discussions at the beginning of June, discussion at the work session in June, and then a discussion at the action meeting in June, where the request was to put them back on for a full discussion with the committee of the whole. So they are back in there this evening. So I guess if there are questions, comments, thoughts, now would be the time to share them.
Thank you. So I guess my comments on the goals are, for goals 1 and 3, I feel like the bullet points underneath those goals are not specific enough. I guess I'd like to see more measurable items that we could then point to. And if you look at, for example, goal 4, which is create an actionable plan to develop a bond referendum to address building infrastructure, security, health, and safety needs. Under that, I think there's some very specific things that we're saying are going to be worked on, like compare new construction of schools to rehabilitation or renovation, explore pros and cons of consolidating and redistricting schools. Those are very specific things that we could measure the success or how far along down the path we got with that goal. But if you look, for example, back to goal 1, which is continue to improve student achievement at all grade levels for all students and decrease achievement gaps where they exist, you know, one of the bullet points is identify achievement gaps based upon demographic group. Each elementary, middle, and high school would develop building-based goals. They seem too broad for me. In my professional life, when we write goals, there are steps or action steps that have to go along with those goals that can be measured so you can define the success of those goals. And I just feel like those 2 goals specifically are missing some of those specific action steps. And related to goal number 1, I know I mentioned this before when we've discussed goals in previous years. I think we have enough data under our belt now where we can start to dive into the different demographic groups, the different levels, and maybe give some specific goals for improvement or changes. Again, just my 2 cents.
Ms. Seidel, let me just clarify. So, like in the first goal where it talks about each middle school, elementary, middle, and high school developing goals, so there will be much more specificity in the building-based ones. Are you looking in here for us to say that the achievement gap between Asian students and Caucasian students will decrease by 1 percentage point, 4 percentage points, 6 percentage? I mean, can you?
Yeah, I think I am. I mean, and maybe it's not for every demographic or every school, but I think there has to be some end game that we're trying to get for it. So for me, this goal looks a lot like it did last year and the year before. So I guess I want to see some steps in there that show what we've done, where we're going, and where we hope to get to. So I do think there should be some level of specificity in there, whether it's at the school level, meaning all elementary schools, or all middle, or both high schools, or all 3 high schools. I'm not sure how to do that, but that's sort of I'm looking for some additional detail.
Okay. We can certainly talk more about that. So there's a challenge that's inherent with that, is you're talking about different kids each year, right? That go through. Like we are not starting with the same starting point. If we were to say that the achievement gaps in 2019-20 should be less than the achievement gaps in 2018-19 or 2001, talking about very different things, because again, we're talking about very different kids, that are coming through. Just the other, and again, we can work on some different suggestions coming through. There's another piece with just the manageability about how specific in what a board goal is looking at that's going to impact 19 schools, again, versus a specific piece to say if we're going to use SAT as a measure, which would really just impact 3 schools or 2 schools, to go through, or if we're going to use NJSLA, which was a brand new assessment last year, what does that look like? Or if we use the district assessments. So there starts to become, if we try to be too specific in some ways, then the goal almost doesn't become, it decreases, I think, in the value in terms of what the programmatically overall that we are looking at. But we can certainly, I'll go back with Dr. Smith and Mrs. Wethington and Dr. Mahan and take a look at that.
So I'm thinking further to Lisa's point, if we identify the achievement gaps, then it's not just the measure, but then the action. So once you identify it, how do you address it? So maybe it's not, okay, you can't put a hard reduce by 3%, to your point, against what's the assessment, but maybe it's looking at what's the equity plan then, because we know there's differences in socioeconomics. So then perhaps it's more about how do you address your equity plan that might ultimately impact what you've identified in your achievement gap. So that perhaps then becomes the action, is what I'm thinking. And on item 4, where it says explore pros and cons of consolidating and redistricting schools, well then that's kind of your soft goal. You're exploring it, but then what's the action? The action is maybe research and present a plan to consolidate and or redistrict, or it's presenting the data upon researching and you don't do any of that. But the action is beyond exploring. Like there has to be some definitive outcome to close it off, is what I'm thinking.
Okay. Okay, so explore, so you're looking more for present pros and cons, consolidating and redistricting.
Right, yeah, so we're exploring it, but then what? What do we do from there? What's the outcome? We either do it or we don't.
Right,
So-
well then, I mean, that becomes so some of that becomes the board's work.
But
right?
that's the action, and then, I mean,
But
exploring isn't a
the
goal.
board would then take that decision. The administration would
Right.
explore it and present it to us, and then
But that's what I'm just
board would
saying.
decide.
Exploring is just kind of a, well, that's nice, we're gonna think about doing it, versus the action of researching, presenting. It's just a very different statement.
So are you looking for it to be a recommendation? Explore and then come back and make a recommendation on which way we should go?
Yeah, there has to be some action to it.
Right. So I mean, would that be a good, so if they explore
Yeah,
it
because we're
and they
gonna
come
take
back
the
and make
action
a-
away.
make a
They're,
recommendation,
yeah, they're gonna make the
and then
recommendation.
we'll act
Right.
based on the recommendation, either for it or against it, but they'll explore it, and then based on whatever criteria, they'll make a recommendation, and then
Right.
that's something we can act on.
Right, I'm just saying the way it reads right now is there's really not, I mean, they'll explore it and then what?
Right. Okay.
That's all I'm saying.
Dr. Malash, regarding Mrs. Seidel's comments about the first goal with the achievement gap, you know, I know we all want to see, you know, something measurable. We'd like to be able to say, you know, that we are moving, you know, forward, you know, in closing the achievement gap. But sometimes those numbers don't always relay, you know, in actuality what's happening. So I would rather not see us rely on just the numbers. I also know that we are, you know, from being on C&I committee for many years, that there are a lot of, you know, best practices programs that are happening in our schools to address the achievement gaps. And maybe perhaps we could look at adding something from that perspective of maybe identifying what some, you know, some of those best practices are that we are seeing even preliminary results from, and then maybe perhaps, you know, looking at the viability of moving those forward. You know, that would be an action that the district is taking, but just looking at it from a little different perspective than just relying on numbers, because hopefully, you know, when in education, when you put best practices in place and they're working, then the tests and the numbers and the things bear that out in the long run. But like you said, it's very difficult in a short term, 1 year, to put in a number and expect that to make a difference or to be meaningful to the work that we want to do in reducing that achievement gap. So maybe we need to look at it a little bit differently, more towards best practices.
So in terms of actions, we're talking about actions, so to create and present a list of best practices to the board to implement, identify and then implement best practices? I guess I'm just looking to
Right.
how to conceptualize it in.
Yeah, for me, perhaps identify current best practices that we are doing. Yeah, and then to look forward, perhaps what's in the pipeline, you know, of what the staff is looking at. There's a lot of innovative things that I know our staff is looking at to move forward. And sometimes we hear about that in C&I, and although we do report on that, you know, there's a lot of things going on in this district. We're very large. You know, so maybe, you know, just consolidating all of that together would be helpful.
I like that idea, actually. And not that, so we identify the achievement gap, that's one thing, but to have I don't know, for lack of better words, a report on, these are the things that were done to address achievement gap. I don't know if everything we do won't be effective necessarily, but we look at the achievement gap and say, these are the best practices. We're going to try and apply these, and will they be effective? Hopefully we'll have a measure of whether they're effective or not, but just to say, okay, these are the things that we've done to address the achievement gap, and this is a report that, you know, can easily be read or understood, and hopefully over a period of time can be actually measured in terms of their effectiveness. So just the idea of saying, okay, it's there, and this is specifically what we're doing to address it. I'm not sure how much of that is already presented in CNI. Maybe it doesn't always filter down or something.
Okay. But you do want us still to identify achievement gaps. Are we still looking to and if yes, is there a measure other than the ones that we have been using? Because if we're going to say there's an achievement gap, we need to talk about achievement towards what, right? High school graduation rates, grades, participation in honors or AP level classes, completing Algebra 1 by the end of 8th grade. Like, is there, you know what I mean? So one piece is, do we want to identify that, yes, there's an achievement gap, or do we not want to identify? I mean, that's, you know, and again, at the board, it's something that we'll continue to do. Much in, and again, we've talked about it here a number of times. So what's encapsulated in these 4 goals is a snapshot of where the areas of focus and attention are throughout the district. It certainly is not the be-all and end-all of what goes on a daily basis. But if it's not NJSLA or, you know, PARC or NJ Ask or ESPA or GEPA or all those kinds of things, you know, is there a different measure that you want us to look at?
Well, I don't know, were people asking not to use those, or?
I don't know that it's not to use them. I guess, what are our peers using? Is that the standard? Like, the other districts, are they using the NJSLA, is it now, or whatever it was before? Like, are those, like, are we being consistent in how we're measuring ourselves to our peers, I guess?
So, I mean, I can certainly share other district goals, other districts' goals with you all. I think you would find that the goal, at least in terms of when it comes to teaching and learning, is much more overly developed here than it is any place else that you'll find. Typically, SAT, ACT, and the state assessment, you know, are what districts are going to use for themselves. You know, when each fall, you know, Val does the presentations, talked about the decrease in the achievement gap, because again, the achievement gap changes, right? The achievement gap is not a static number that exists. It changes on both ends. Yeah, I'm just trying to get an idea of, right, because if we're having the discussion about how is it, what can we show, or what can we demonstrate, you know, what's the measure that that you want us to be able to focus on, at least at this level, and be able to present back to you and to the community.
So maybe I didn't do a great job of explaining this. So in my opinion, we've had, at least since I've been on the board, we've had several years of a similar goal where we want to improve the student achievement at all grade levels and decrease the achievement gaps. So presumably we've learned a lot of stuff along the way and have tried things that have failed, tried things that have successful. I guess what I'm I would be looking for is this is an ongoing goal. So I'd like to see some steps that show the progress we've made along the way. You know, we're going to continue to improve student achievement. These are the things we believe that are working well, that have helped close some of those gaps, and maybe we don't need a percentage, or we don't need to identify which demographic group it assisted, but here's some things that we've learned along the way that have worked well in helping us reach our goal, so we're going to continue those. Here are some things that we haven't tried yet that we think we may be trying to help continue. So I guess I'm more looking for some of the meat and potatoes behind how we're going to do that. Hopefully I did a better job of letting you know where my thinking is there.
I'll throw this thing out also. One of the things I believe we do it well as a district, it seems like we're able to take data based on student achievement and find consistencies or inconsistencies in terms of areas where the students are achieving or not achieving, and really take that data and then tailor the instruction in order to address those issues. At least what I've seen, I'm pretty impressed with how that's been able to be done, at least in theory. I'm not sure how it actually happens in the classroom per se, but in theory, we're able to come up with those ideas and address it. And maybe part of the goal is just kind of highlighting some of those many ways that maybe it's not necessarily doing things necessarily different per se, but highlighting how we're addressing those issues and how we're addressing those things in the process. I'm not sure if that's kind of what you're thinking.
Yes, it is. Again, this is a goal that I think never goes away, and it's always our top priority. But I do think we learn stuff every year that helps us narrow that gap, hopefully. And then a new gap opens, and then you need to figure out what works for that. So I guess I'd just like to see some more detail in the things we're doing and the things we want to do to continue to improve student achievement across the board.
Can I just shift the focus to goal number 3, the enhanced communication and relationship, specifically bullet 1, 2, 3. So we continue to re-examine, expand, and redefine the district's electronic presence. So I see that we have the develop and begin the implementation of the plan to revise the structure and efficiency of the district and school web pages. So is there any way that I know we don't want to maybe develop and begin and implement, but I would like to maybe just see something in the way of maybe starting the conversation to address the district's social media presence and how we're going to start to maybe develop a plan. I think it's probably really ambitious to develop and implement that this year, but just maybe to kind of create or start the discussion. I just would really like to call that out specifically, our social media, and the way we're going to maybe start that conversation and maybe have some dialogue around that.
About our social media presence.
Yeah, just the way we're going to, I guess, maybe start to think about using the Twitter and Facebook pages and maybe start to use that a little bit differently. Again, I know that it might be a little aggressive to maybe implement, but maybe just to maybe have some discussion, but maybe to have that as just a goal.
I agree. Yeah, something that's like develop the strategic vision around it. Yeah, somewhere encompassed in that, so it calls it out separately.
Yeah.
I like the idea of baby steps on that because
Yes.
because school boards, you go there, they tell you time and time again, do not get engaged on social media, don't go down the path, they tell you to avoid Facebook and all that, but yet, I mean, our communities are changing. The way that many people do embrace Facebook is a method of communicating and all that, but school boards has still remained pretty strong against it. So I think we need to figure out, and maybe we're going to be the trailblazers in that area, but we need to figure out taking baby steps, because it just seems like it's a quagmire if you really get too involved in that area. But if we could have a planned approach, I don't know what that is. So
Strategic vision.
okay, strategic vision.
Also related to Goal 3, I just wanted to say that I really am excited for the State of District publication. I think that is a great idea. We heard through the ad hoc committee that many people were not as informed about the state of our district as they would have liked to have been, especially now that they don't vote on the budget. Some people used to take that opportunity to learn about what we need, what opportunity areas we have. So I think this State of the District publication is a great idea. I know you did sort of a mini version of that when Dr. Repollet visited us, and I thought that was fantastic. And I'm really looking forward to that. I think that's going to be a great communication tool for our community. Thank you.
Any other thoughts? Go ahead.
Sorry. So just along the same lines of maybe putting a timeline or an action step. So under item number 4, which is the actionable plan to develop the next version of the bond referendum, develop a district alternative funding committee and a district safety and security committee, including students, staff, and community members. I'm assuming the goal is to roll those out in the year. Yes. So I guess maybe if we could put that, with intention to have committees functional by X, that way that gives us a timeline to shoot for.
Any other thoughts before we move on? Okay. Got a lot to chew on now.
That's right. We will, I'll put an updated draft in the memo on Thursday. Right.
Thank you. Okay. Next, we're going to move on to our special action agenda. And I'm going to ask Mrs. Neary to move the CNI items, please.
Let's hope I do this right this time since I'm going first. The superintendent recommends, and I move the following. Number 1, approval of attendance and conference and workshops for the 2019-2020 school year. Number 2, approval of out-of-district student placements for 2019-2020 school year. Number 3, approval of special education settlement agreement. Number 4, approval to submit fiscal year 2020 IDEA application and accept IDEA allocation. And then you also have a yellow sheet with item number 5, approval of special education legal settlement. Do I have any questions?
Second.
Oh, second, sorry. This is Matlack. Do I have any questions? Okay, seeing none. Mrs. Sugars?
Mrs. Neary,
Yes.
Mrs. Matlack,
Yes.
Mrs. Seidel,
Yes.
Mrs. Schultz,
Yes.
Mrs. Tong,
Yes.
Mr. Goodwin.
Yes. Thank you, Ms. Neary. Next, I'm going to ask Mrs. Schultz to move the BNF items, please.
The superintendent recommends and I move the following. Number 1, financial reports. Number 2, resolution for the award of bids. Number 3, resolution for participation in coordinated cooperative transportation. Number 4, oh, shoot. Sorry. It's on the wrong. Let me start that over.
You're on the work session.
The superintendent recommends and I move the following. Number 1, approval of bill list, and number 2, resolutions. Do I have a second? Mrs. Madlack, are there any questions? Seeing none.
Mrs. Schultz,
I need to abstain on the bill list to Bayada Home Health, and yes to the rest.
Mrs. Matlack,
Yes.
Mrs. Neary,
Yes.
Mrs. Seidel,
I have to abstain from CDW on the bill list. Yes to the rest.
Mrs. Tong,
Yes.
Mr. Goodwin.
Yes. Thank you, Mrs. Schultz. Next, I'm going to ask Mrs. Seidel to move the HR items, please.
Thank you, Mr. Goodwin. The superintendent recommends, and I move the following. Number 1, termination of employment certificated. Number 2, termination of employment non-certificated. Number 3, appointments certificated. Number 4, appointments non-certificated. Number 5, other compensation certificated. And you have a very thick pink sheet in front of you with additions to 1, 3, 4, 6, 7, and 8. And I'm being motioned.
And also on the handout, item 3L, for summer employment, the date should be 7/1/19 to 8/31/19.
Thank you. Do I have a second? Mrs. Neary, any questions? Okay, Mr. Sugars.
Mrs. Seidel,
Yes to all.
Mrs. Matlack,
Yes.
Mrs. Neary,
Yes.
Mrs. Schultz,
Yes.
Mrs. Tong,
Yes.
Mr. Goodwin.
Yes. And I'm going to go ahead and move the P&L items. The superintendent recommends, and I move the following: approval of harassment, intimidation, bullying, investigation decisions. Number 2, approval of harassment, intimidation, bullying, investigation, hearing decision. Do I have a second? Mrs. Matlack, are there any questions? If not, Mrs. Sugars.
Mr. Goodwin,
Yes.
Mrs. Matlack,
Yes.
Mrs. Neary,
Yes.
Mrs. Seidel,
I need to abstain from items 1 and 2.
Mrs. Schultz,
Yes.
Mrs. Tong.
Yes.
Okay. We don't have any strategic planning items on the action agenda. So we're going to go ahead and move to our second public comment section, and you can comment on any item. We just ask that you speak your name and address into the speaker. You'll be given 3 minutes to speak, and there's a timer right above here that will let you know when your time's up.
Yoni Yaris, 422 Cherry Hill Boulevard. Wondering for Matilda if there's any plan to bring the elementary school students on a special showing. I know when I was in district, it happened every so often that the elementary school and middle school students were invited to a during the day production. Especially with this one, where it'd be a great opportunity for students to view the movie, the play, and the book, and talk about the difference of literature and what was changed, what wasn't, across multiple levels at a high school, middle school, and elementary school level. Also just love Matilda on a personal level. Wondering for facility rentals, are we looking at security? I know there's times I've walked into buildings at rental periods when I got lost going to west because I still don't know my way around that building. That are we going to be securing that better just because there could be people who use that time or are monitoring the building to use it to be able to get in access to areas they shouldn't be in. So just wondering where that's going to evolve with. Curious about recruitment, how we did with minority recruitment. I know the district is really dedicated to it as part of the 5-year plan. We just did a large hiring for kindergarten. Just curious how we're doing on bringing in non-white males and et cetera into the district. Thinking the remote access might be a good topic for the reorg meeting, the retreat meeting following the reorg meeting, when you bring on new members or come back together with a full board at that point to talk about the need starting off right at the beginning of the board year. Curious about what happened and where we are in the bond discussion timeline. I know things have gotten a little quirky with the board restructuring going on right now. I just felt like right now, I remember to me, the whole meeting was supposed to be discussing those potentially when Dr. Malash presented the ideal timeline in February or March, if I'm remembering correctly. Curious about the streaming now committee meetings. The board seems interested in that. When at a previous meeting, Mr. Goodwin seemed to express the board's intent of not doing that per now. So I'm curious just where that's going. Going back to the vacancy process, I was concerned that there was only one posting on social media, only one email went out. That was prior to the weekend. It would have been nice for another reminder post to go out today, knowing that the 5 o'clock time was challenging for many people in the public. And I'm grateful to my wife for letting me go out for this meeting. Also challenging in terms of attendance of board members at the previous meeting when you selected the final 4 and someone missing tonight as well. I know it was the summer and it's hard, but this is your process, not the public's process, and hoping for more inclusivity from you guys as well. And I'm disappointed that the names were not shared publicly. As someone who did apply, I personally expected it to be shared publicly. As a public position, I don't think there is any assumption of privacy when you apply for such position. Going to a more positive note, just want to say the Kingston community has been really welcoming to the Kilmer community for the kindergarten readiness program, with Kilmer currently being under mass construction on the inside. The program was moved over to Kingston, and it was really nice that both Dr. Marble and Dr. Wick were out in the rain greeting families as they came in the other day. And it's just, once again, the incredible administrators we have in this district going above and beyond. And then just a reminder about the additional sheets, if they could be given out to the public as well who aren't here.
Thank you.
My name is Jeff Podowitz. I live in 110 Kilburn Drive, Cherry Hill, New Jersey. One thing that I'd say before this testimony of Sharon Joshio, Cherry Hill Board of Education, March 20th, 2007. I wish it would post it on the website. When it comes to SFRA and every funding formula, the money was supposed to follow the at-risk child. An example is Cherry Hill. We have about almost 20% free and reduced lunch. Our LEP is $355. Our capped aid is $1,706, and okay, that's what we are with Cherry Hill. Chesterfield, that really complained about a lot of things. Their free and reduced lunch is 1.93%. Their LEP is 2. Their capped aid per pupil is $3,428 this year. So the money is obviously not following the at-risk child. Lenape Regional School District, the district that's being cut, their free and reduced lunch is around $744. Their LEP is 33. Their aid is being cut, and they're fighting, and they have every right to fight. Their per pupil is $4,000. That's pretty sad for Cherry Hill. You talk about achievement gap. We're a community that's becoming more and more economically diverse. According to funding formulas, we should be getting more funding. We're not. We're not getting the money to help support our economically diverse population. And that really hurts our community as a whole and the kids who are coming into Cherry Hill. So you talk about achievement gaps, the more economically diverse you are, the more likely you are to have achievement caps. Years ago, when an assistant superintendent said that it takes to get up to the level of Cherry Hill, and this was a number of years ago, 5 years. 5 years. So it's very, very hard to measure if someone comes into Cherry Hill. It really takes 5 years to get them up to snuff at Cherry Hill. At least that's what this assistant superintendent at a meeting said. One of the things that I said was, well, that's great. Well, if they're coming from a district like Chesterfield, which gets quite a bit more money than we do, then why don't we get their money for 5 years? The amount per pupil they get. Same with Lenape, getting so much more money than we are, 4,000 versus 1,700. And I'm not saying they don't deserve it, they do. But 1,700 for us per pupil is a joke. Why don't we get that extra money for 5 years? We got to bring kids up to our level, right? Anyway, that's it.
Rick Short, 1002 Chelton Parkway. These questions are more for, I guess, the administrators. First one is Ms. Sugars. This new policy share document, do we have to kind of Oprah it, or will it come out on our website or something? It'd be a great idea if we didn't have to Oprah it. My next question for Ms. Sugars is there any updates with the bond, the bond that passed, the state bond for the Alyssa law money? Supposedly, according to the New Jersey Senate, it's $5,000 a school to hook up a red light, which is wrong. It has to be a blue light. They did that wrong in the bill, but anyway, it's $5,000 per school. We have 14 schools to do. That's a cost of $70,000. Are we going to be getting money from the state for that $70,000, and are we going to be compliant by September? I haven't heard anybody in the board talk about this. The next thing is has to do with some of the stuff that Ben was talking about tonight, some of the positive things. You did some great things last year, starting an A and B team. Remember, this year, Carusi had over 170 runners try out. We had over 100. When you do the numbers, that's a third of the school. 33% of the school is out exercising. That is great news. You're doing great. Now we're talking about this new policy share thing where you want to increase the costs for the individual schools, outside organizations to use our fields. You're going to increase the cost, and they're already under stress with paying lighting fees and everything else. So I think the bigger picture, the bigger thing which we should be as a board, as responsible taxpayers should be, is the fact that there was a bid that just went out. There was a $1.2 million difference between the starting and the high, and there was only 2 bidders. Now, remember last year with the roofing, they had 5 bidders. Everybody was in the same thing. Everything was looking good. So, guys, 2 bids, $1.2 million difference? Come on. Worry about that, not the $3,000 increase you're going to get from hurting other organizations. The last thing, there was some talk on social media between myself and Ms. Seidel about Woodcrest. I'm sure Dr. Malash doesn't know about it, maybe Mr. Soprano doesn't know about it, but there was different procedures about taking in students, so I don't know if that was resolved. And the last thing I have here is some time to time I get letters or correspondence from teachers, students, and these seem to be verifiable things that are occurring. And I'll do some Oprah to talk about it, but I'll pass it on to the board to review. Some of the questions are some inside things that are happening, like not using electrical permits. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments? Okay. Well, if not,
There's really not a whole lot other than I expect that there will be an opportunity for some of the lower schools to see Matilda. We do expect that lower school children will be in the show, at least based on what they've done. Recruitment certainly is going well. We have a diverse group. We'd always like a much more diverse group of folks that we are hiring, although we've done pretty well this summer. Part of the challenge is diversity in the candidates. I agree that we should be getting much more money from the state. The new policy about facilities, the change in the use of facilities, it's at a discussion point. No, nothing has been put forward to the full board yet, so that'll continue to be discussed. Once it is, it'll be published on the website. I believe Alyssa's law is a December date for Alyssa's law, and I don't think we've gotten guidance. The state still has not provided any guidance to anybody about how to access the money. As soon as they do, we'll be accessing the money that's there. And if there's a concern about security at one of the buildings, rather than have a discussion on Facebook, much like the police chief has said, much rather you contact us, you know, call before you post. Don't just post and have a discussion. Let us know. You know, Mr. Saporito works 12 months out of the year just like the rest of us. So there's a concern about security, please let us know.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Malash. With that, we're going to go ahead and adjourn the meeting. We're going to be going into recess. Well, recess. We're going to be going to closed session to discuss the board vacancy and I believe one other item. So, can I have a motion?
I make a motion. What
Go
you
to
said.
clo-
To recess into closed session.
Okay, thank you. And do I need a second? Okay, Mrs. Schultz. All right.